So, starting again with these types of summative evaluation, you've got your outcome evaluation, which is your KSAs, you have your impact evaluation. So, let's start talking about this outcome evaluation. So, you usually collect quantitative data for this when you're assessing a group of people's knowledge, skills, attitudes, and beliefs. So typically, you are going to need to start with some sort of baseline, right? So you need a pre-test or a baseline data. So this is typically some sort of an instrument that, like a questionnaire, for example, that is going to assess your target population's knowledge, skills, attitudes, beliefs about a topic or a health behavior or a health issue. So you do that earlier on in the program, right? To be able, before anybody gets any part of the program. So you have a baseline knowing what students, learners, I guess, would come in with. And you do that with a pretest or a baseline. Then you implement the program. And then after the program, you give the same exact questionnaire. So, same exact instrument. So, you're comparing apples to apples, and you can see, did they have gains in their knowledge, attitudes, beliefs, skills? And that's the extent of the change that you've seen. So, some tips when you're conducting an outcome evaluation, think about everything hinges on your objectives. So, go back to your objectives and see those are going to tell you what you're looking for, and really, in essence, are going to tell you what you need to measure. So, look at your objectives, your short term outcome objectives, and decide how you're going to measure each one of those. Figure out how you're going to collect the data. So is it, online? Is it, what day of the week are you going to do it? Who's going to send it out? Is it in person? How is that going to be done? And again, as we talked about before, you need to collect that baseline or pre-test data before starting any program activities, and then use the same exact instrument. Sometimes you'll have people who will add a question or two at the end about like the quality of the program, which clearly somebody couldn't fill that out in a baseline because they haven't had the program. So it's okay to add a few questions to your post test or your evaluation at the end, but make sure you are using the same questions that you used in that pre-test or that baseline instrument. So, what about an impact evaluation? So, remember, your impact evaluation includes those intermediate and long term objectives. So, you've got like that, if you're talking about an outcome evaluation, it's just those KSAs. When you're talking about impact, what changed? So did people's behavior change? Did that make a change in their health status? Was the program effective in changing health status? Was there anything unexpected that you found, either positive or negative? Did the program overall make a difference in whatever that longer term goal that you had or longer term objectives that you had for your program? And a question, it's nice if you can answer this, is can this program produce similar results in a different setting? So is this something that could be used if you wanted to scale it to a different, scale it up to a larger population or a different population? So, impact evaluation, this is going to look very familiar. All of you have had research methods. So, really, this section of your chapter is review for you. Just thinking about, you all know, or if you don't, kind of this will jog your memory. Are you using an experimental design, a quasi experimental design, or a non experimental design? You've learned this in your research methods class. So, if you need a review, read carefully this information that's in your chapter. What sort of sample do you need to have? So, consider, do you need to survey the whole group? If you have less than 100 people participating, you need to sample everyone, right? You need to give everybody the baseline, the baseline evaluation. You need to give everybody the post evaluation. But if you have more than 100, there are formulas to help you determine how many people out of that whole population that you implemented to do you need to sample. Think about doing random sampling. That is definitely the gold standard. If you could do random sampling where you are, pulling some people, out of your population to measure their effects, that is much better than if you are doing non-random sampling. This, in essence, just gives you some ideas about how to do random sampling. And again, or if you're doing stratified random sampling, so make sure that you're familiar with these. Again, some review from what you've had in research methods. If you are using a non-random sampling technique, you may be using one of these techniques. Clearly the gold standard is if you are doing simple random sampling for an experimental method. Like that's like the gold standard, which we'll talk about in just a second. But if you can't do that, there are these other ways of pulling a sample to assess what they've learned, what new behaviors that they're doing there, and their health outcomes. This is the section in your book that talks about sample size. There's a relationship, as you remember from research methods, between the number of your sample size and how high your confidence level is, meaning how likely are you to get those same results again and again and again if you repeated that measure. Margin of error. Remember, margin of error is, you might get like a result, but if you say there's a margin of error of 3, for example, that means that what you are saying, let's see, 82% of students when surveyed support a mask mandate for SIUE campus. If you have a margin of error of 3, that means your actual percentage is most likely to be anywhere 3 percentage points higher or 3 percentage points lower. So anywhere in that entire range, and that's your margin of error. And again, these are things that you learned about in research methods. So we're going to kind of skim through these. Here's your population size and the result. If you look table 7.5, it's kind of handy. You probably have seen this in your research methods textbook before, but this gives you a sense. And I said earlier that if you had 100, just survey all 100. If you have up to 100, survey all 100. If you have exactly 100, you can sample only 80. But also remember to have a certain amount of like oversampling, because not everybody is going to fill out your survey, right? So make sure that you're not just asking 80 out of the 100. You might want to ask them all, because you might have a 20% non-return, meaning 20% of the people won't take your survey. And this is kind of what we just said. The concept of a control group. So, know the difference between a control group and a comparison group. So control group is randomly sampled, right? And that will give you an experimental design. So if you use a control group versus a participant group using random sampling, that means you have an experimental design. So again, kind of going back to research methods, but it works the same way with program evaluation. Because remember, program evaluation is just a specific type of research. You might use a quasi-experimental design. In quasi-experimental design, as you'll recall, this has to do with, instead of using a control group where there is random assignment as to who gets the program and who doesn't, you use a quasi-experimental design, meaning that you use a comparison group. So they are not randomly assigned. So instead of taking a group of 100 students in a school and randomly assigning 50 of them to the control group and 50 of them to a group that's going to get information about COVID, what you would do with a quasi-experimental design is you would take one person's class of 50 and give them the study, or give them the program about COVID information, and you would take the other class of 50 and not give them the program and study them as well and make some comparisons. But because they are not randomly assigned, we have to call them a comparison group, not a control group, because there may be differences between the two of them. Non-experimental design, this is typically when you don't have a comparison group. So there's no comparison group, there's no control group. You just have the people that did your program. So if you've got a pre-test, post-test design, you've got that pre-test as your baseline, you implement the program, and then you've got a post-test where you assess what has changed between the 2 points. Post-test only design is when you don't have that baseline, and all you have is that information at the end. A little less helpful, although in program implementation, we do see this sometimes. It's sometimes that's the most practical way to do it, is a pre-test, post-test, non-experimental design, or sometimes even just doing the post-test. There is still data you can gather from that. It is not as good as if you have a pre-test, post-test, and it's not as good as if you have an experimental design. But sometimes we have to see what actually fits, what we have the resources for, and that's what we choose. The rest of your chapter really talks about the CDC framework for program evaluation and really does a nice job of like walking you through step by step by step. So if you're interested in that, you can look at your textbook, kind of learning those pieces on how that's done step by step. Or you can actually look online. If you just Google this, it will take you to the CDC site that kind of walks you through how to do this step by step. So this is, again, just a framework, like one option of how you would do what we just talked about. The last piece is, how are you going to share this information? So typically at the end of a program, or when you have done this program evaluation, you're going to have this plan, right, of who you're going to share the information with. So you need to write an evaluation plan at the beginning. So figure out like how you're going to do this. So, talk about it with your stakeholders, plan it. So it's interesting because you think about your planning for the evaluation, which happens at the end. Well, it can happen like during the program too, but you're planning for that in the very beginning. And that is one of those skills that public health educators, we know how to do, and we know the importance of planning your evaluation up front. So here is, an idea of how to write that plan according to the CDC. Here is an idea of where you would put this in a timeline. So remember, we've talked about Gantt charts. This is a specific timeline. So this isn't exactly a Gantt chart. I mean, this might be like an item on your Gantt chart, like saying, questionnaire is released via online to all participants, say, for example. But this is more of a specific to evaluation. So what's the question? What are you looking at? How are you sampling it? What's your, if you're using a survey method, is it a questionnaire? How did you sample it? When are you doing it? Who's going to do it? Who analyzes it? And is this quantitative or qualitative? All right, so your report. So this is at the end when you have completed all this evaluation. So remember, we talked about this needs to be reported out, and it just depends on what you have agreed in your planning who is going to get this information and in what format. So oftentimes you'll have a written report that has these components to it. And this is in your textbook if you want to look through this on your own to sort of see what an evaluation plan and a reporting would look like if you did this on your own. All right, and that's the end of your chapter 7 on evaluating.